The Birth of the United States by Isaac Asimov. The Road to Revolution. The Second Round. In July 1766, Rockingham, under whose leadership the Stamp Act was repealed, was dismissed by George III for reasons having nothing to do with the colonies. From then on, Rockingham, and those who followed him, remained favorable to the American cause, but they also remained out of power. George III, having been forced to back down, tried the experiment of a ministry which would represent a wide variety of views, and accepted none other than William Pitt to head it. If Pitt had been a younger or healthier man, there might have been some chance for conciliation, but the fortune of history dictated otherwise. Never really hale, Pitt, though still only in his late 50s, was a shattered man. He accepted an earldom and became first Earl of Chatham. This removed him from the House of Commons and put him into the easier atmosphere of the House of Lords. More and more, he withdrew from active leadership, and for some years did not even appear in Parliament. The Duke of Grafton, who succeeded him, had no capacity, and the ministry he headed was really run, therefore, by the strongest man in it. This was Charles Townshend, a witty man who could speak eloquently, especially when he was slightly under the influence of liquor. All he lacked was judgment. Townshend was Chancellor of the Exchequer, something like the American office of Secretary of the Treasury, and it was his duty to find the money to support the government. This remained a thankless task, and especially at this time when the colonies were all too conscious of their success in forcing repeal of the Stamp Act. It did not occur to Townshend, or to any member of the government, to explore the possibility of having the colonial assemblies themselves impose taxes on the Americans. That would have seemed to them to be an intolerable admission of defeat, and to have set a precedent that would lead inevitably to the total loss of control of Great Britain over the colonies. No, it seemed to the parliamentary leaders that Britain itself must tax the colonies. But how? On May 8, 1767, Townshend treated himself to a large helping of champagne, then, rather ebullient, delivered what was afterward called the Champagne Speech. In it, he sparkled as effervescently as the champagne and heaped ridicule on those who opposed him, in particular on Grenville, who was still buried under the disgrace of having passed the unlucky Stamp Act. Stung into response, Grenville called out that Townshend might speak bravely, but he dared not tax the Americans. Hotly, Townshend refuted the charge and swore he would tax the Americans and proceeded to do so. He avoided the direct tax and went back to the indirect tax on American imports. The Americans had never officially objected to the British right to control trade and had been paying duties regularly whenever they were caught, which wasn't often. It seemed to Townshend, therefore, only a matter of placing duties on new commodities, raising the duties on old ones, and improving collection. By June 29, he had pushed acts through Parliament which placed duties on tea, glass, paper, and dyestuffs, effective as of November 20, 1767. Writs of assistance were to be issued, and customs officials were to be granted wider powers in order to stop the smuggling. In this way, it was hoped that £40,000 a year would be raised. This could be used, in part, to pay governors and judges in the colonies. This would have had the effect of placing the colonial executives and judiciary under parliamentary control, since it would be Parliament, and no longer the colonial legislatures, who would hold the purse strings. The so-called Townshend Acts were a miracle of poor judgment. The passage without colonial consultation, the projected manner of collection, and the announced purpose, all combined to exasperate Americans. In the mood in which the colonies found themselves then, the acts were merely provocations to new disorders, and the hornets were stirred up again. Indeed, the hornets had not yet stopped flying and did not require the further irritation of taxation to make them troublesome. Although the Stamp Act had been repealed, the Quartering Act had not, and any American at any time could still be made the unwilling host of a soldier or soldiers if the commanding general of the British troops in America saw fit to place him there. The commanding general was Thomas Gage, who was not overladen with either tact or ability. He had come to America in 1755 with Braddock, had led the advance guard at the defeat at Fort Duquesne, see the shaping of North America, and had managed to survive. He served in the later course of the war without particular distinction, and in 1763, with the rank of Major General, had become Commander-in-Chief of all the British forces in North America. It was he who had requested Parliament to pass the Quartering Act, which did not increase his popularity with Americans. Gage's headquarters were in New York, and it irritated him to have the colonial authorities continually interfering with his efforts to place his officers and men in comfortable quarters. In a fury, he demanded that the New York Assembly order enforcement of the Quartering Act. This the Assembly stoutly refused to do, and Gage put pressure on New York's governor to dissolve the body. This was done on December 19, 1766, and Parliament later confirmed the act. A new and more conservative assembly was then elected, and it permitted quartering. All this accomplished, both in New York and elsewhere, was to increase popular hatred of the soldiers. The term redcoat became a term of insult and anger among Americans. The news of the Townshend Acts, and of the troubles with the New York Assembly, spread over the colonies together. It was clear that not only did the British government have no intention of working through the colonial assemblies, it was intent on making those same assemblies exist only at parliamentary pleasure. At this rate, Americans would soon be left with no self-government at all and would be subject to a pure parliamentary despotism. The situation was made to order for Samuel Adams, who instantly began to beat the drums for a renewal of the boycott program that had done so much to force repeal of the Stamp Act. In September 1767, even before the Townshend Acts had come into force, public meetings in Boston were setting up non-importation agreements. Adams wrote to radical leaders in other colonies too, to spread the word, and Sons of Liberty everywhere began to make it hot for customs officials. Adams was a brilliant agitator and made the most of his opportunities, but he could have done nothing without the help of British folly. So extreme was Adams in his views that most of the American leaders would surely have turned against him if they had had the chance to do so. The American leaders of the time were as aristocratic in their leanings as the British were, as confirmed in the belief that government should be handled by those men of better family who were also men of property, and as fearful of what we call democracy and what they would have thought of as mob rule. If the British had accepted the American leaders as their partners, there is every likelihood that there would still be a political relationship between the United States and Great Britain today, as between Canada and Great Britain. It was because Great Britain would not bend so far and persisted in a hardline approach that many American conservatives were forced into the arms of such radicals as Adams, Otis, and Henry. An example of this was John Dickinson, who had dominated the Stamp Act Congress. He came of a well-to-do family, was a large landowner, had studied law both in Philadelphia and in England, and was a conservative man who was utterly pro-British in his feelings. And yet he could not agree that the British had the right to make laws for the Americans without any consideration whatever of any possible American say in the matter. In the wake of the Townshend Acts, Dickinson took up his pen and, beginning on December 2nd, wrote Letters of a Farmer. Altogether, there were 14 of these, which appeared far and wide in American newspapers through the winter of 1767 to 1768, and which were then published in pamphlet form. In the letters, Dickinson protested his loyalty to Great Britain, accepted the right of the British to regulate American trade, urged Americans to participate in no violent demonstrations, and refused to appeal to the doctrine of natural rights. Nevertheless, Dickinson expressed himself forcefully against the Townshend Acts and against the suspension of the New York Assembly, as depriving Americans of their rights as Englishmen. It was not their natural rights of which they were deprived in his view, but of their specific rights under British law. What Dickinson wanted, apparently, was limited self-rule for America, the kind of relationship that an American state has to the central government today. A system of the kind Dickinson dimly envisaged and of the kind that was eventually, but only with a great deal of trouble, worked out in the United States, was completely unprecedented at the time. The British Parliament could not possibly see it. George III wanted no compromise, and the parliamentary majority was strongly in favor of law and order policies. The Americans must be made to understand who were the masters.